Hi, the last time we met, I showed you this book and told you the story behind the writing of it. And I asked the question, what has this book got to do with these 9 books here? And the answer to that is research. Hi, my name is Robert Cubitt, and I'm here to tell you another story behind the story of the writing of my books, in particular, the 9 books I just showed you. Every book, of course, has a story in it, but every book has a second story, and that is the story of how it came to be written. And those are the stories I'm telling you in this series of videos. So, in the story behind the story of the writing of this book, my father went to the National Army Museum to record some audio cassettes telling of his life in the army and his wartime service and his service in Number 3 Commando. I got hold of those tapes and decided that the stories in them were far too good for them just to be left in a drawer gathering dust, and I turned them into this book here, in the process of which I had to do an awful lot of research. So for about a year, I immersed myself in World War II and in the story of the Commandos and in the stories of the Commandos operations. And in the end, I came up with this non-fiction book of my father's life. But I'm not really a non-fiction writer. I'm a fiction writer. I'm at my happiest when I'm making up stories. And here I had all this research piled up on my desk and on my hard drive and in photographs and all sorts of other resources. And I just knew I had to do something with it other than just finish this book, The Commando Stories. So what I did was turn all that research into these 9 books. Now, 5 of them are based very much on my father's own war service career. All I've done was create some characters to take his place and the place of his friends. I did move some of the locations slightly, just so I could play around with the stories a bit more. But 5 of those books are very much fictionalized accounts of my father's war service. The other 4, however, vary between being totally fictional with no basis in fact, and part fiction, part fact, in that they were real operations or inspired by real operations, but they weren't involving my father's commando. So there you go, 9 books, 9 stories, some of them very fictional, some of them very close to the truth. So let's start with book 1, Operation Absalom. Quite obviously it's set in Norway. You can see that from the map there. Now, in 1941, my father went on his first operational sortie, his first real live action, and in December of that year, he went on a raid to Norway, which was quite a famous raid in itself. I took that basic story and what happened there, and then I created a lot of fiction to go around it to make it into an exciting book, I hope. Although, of course, the actual raid itself was exciting enough. Book 2, Operation Tightrope, was inspired by real events, although it didn't involve Number 3 Commando at all. Partly it was inspired by Operation Mincemeat, which you may have heard of. It was turned into a film a few years ago, which I only watched quite recently. The other part of it is based on Operation Biting, which was the first parachute raid carried out by the British into France. So not a commando raid, it was a paratroop raid, but I stole the idea and turned it into this book. The third book, I'm afraid, was all too real. It was based on Operation Jubilee, which was a military catastrophe. A raid on Dieppe in northern France that took place in August 1942 resulted in huge numbers of casualties for Canadian infantry, who were the assault force, and it also resulted in heavy losses for the commandos, Number 3 Commando and Number 4 Commando, who were tasked with neutralizing artillery batteries on either side of the town. So just to take a little bit of the personal out of it, I moved the location of of the raid to somewhere else. But otherwise, it's pretty much based on what happened at the time. Operation Carthage is based on the movements of Number 3 Commando, in as much as they did go to the places that I described, but the operations were very, very fictional. So they go to Gibraltar first, and from there they transfer to Algeria, which had been invaded in late 1942 by a joint American and British force. From that, I involved my fictional Stephen Carter in the Battle of Kasserine, which took place up there in Tunisia. From there, continuing to follow Number 3 Commando around North Africa and the Mediterranean, 3 Commando went to Egypt, where I've created a fictional story for my hero Stephen Carter. But then after that, we get into the very real stories of the invasion of Sicily at Syracuse, which is about there, and then a raid to capture a bridge that was needed for the advance north through Sicily, which was up there. And that particular operation nearly ended up in catastrophe for the Commandos. They were stranded behind enemy lines because the ground troops that Montgomery said would be there within 24 hours didn't turn up. Montgomery had a track record of not planning his advances of his ground troops as well as he might and leaving people strung out on a limb. He did it here in 1943. He would do it again in 1943 in Italy. And of course, he did it very famously in 1944 with Operation Market Garden. From Sicily, we go to the Italian mainland. The first third of the book is a fictional story, which I put in there. And then after that, we get into real operations again with 3 Commando going ashore in Italy and mounting operations in Italy. And once again, the great General Montgomery left Number 3 Commando out on a limb because he couldn't get the ground forces to them to relieve them in the time they said. And once again, it almost ended up as disaster for the Commandos. Operation Pegasus was supposed to be the last book in the series. It covers the period from D-Day right up to the end of the war. It follows my father's adventures through France, landing on D-Day, through Belgium, through the Netherlands, through Germany itself, all the way to the Baltic. And Number 3 Commando, the real unit involved, actually ended up on VE Day fishing the bodies of concentration camp victims out of the Baltic Sea. A very tragic end of the war for them. And I've just transposed my fictional Stephen Carter and his friends onto that story and followed the same path. But after Operation Pegasus was published, I started getting emails from fans of the series saying, what's going to happen now? The war's over. What's Stephen Carter going to do? What's Prof and Paddy and Danny going to do? What are they going to do now? Well, I moved the story on 10 years in response to that and wrote a completely fictional story set in Malaya, which just happens to be somewhere else my father served. But by that time, he wasn't a commando, he was just regular infantry again. And in fact, he was actually on loan service with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, training Malayan soldiers in preparation for the independence of that country, which would, of course, eventually become Malaysia. But there was a very nasty little war going on there, which wasn't even called a war. It was called an emergency, and it cost the lives of lots of men. So I got my commandos mixed up in that story. And then after that, I moved the story on another 20 years into Northern Ireland, and we, of course, we all know what was happening there. This time, Stephen Carter is very much a civilian, but he gets himself mixed up in stuff over which he has no control. And he gets into quite a lot of trouble there. And that, I'm afraid, is the last story in the Carter's Commandos series. For more stories about the story behind the story of my books, join me in my next video.